Hi guys, I just wanted to thank Squarespace for sponsoring this show. It's my website of choice because they have 24/7 customer service, you get your own domain name, and they have amazing designer templates that work across all devices. You can start your own online store or your own website today with a free trial at squarespace.com, and you can also get a 10% discount off your first purchase using the offer code Karl. So, make your next move with Squarespace. Hi, I'm Karl Taylor. I'm an ambassador for Hasselblad Camera Company, and today I'm going to do a test of the new Hasselblad H6 100 megapixel versus my H5 50 megapixel and the Sony A7R 42 megapixel. Now, first of all, let me explain why I'm doing this test. Well, I currently use the H5 50 megapixel CCD chip version. Now, that chip is not very good at high ISOs, which I occasionally need. The H6 100 megapixel is the newer chip in the CMOS version, which is capable at high ISO settings. Now, for most of my work as a product and advertising photographer, I'm not actually too worried about high ISOs. What I am concerned about is detail, resolution, and issues like diffraction. So I wanted to test the H6 100 thoroughly with a very sort of scientific setup to look for issues like diffraction at smaller apertures like f/16 and f/22, because that's the area that I'm shooting most in for detailed product photography. And I thought it would be interesting to also throw the Sony in the mix, because this is renowned as one of the highest resolution and sharpest full-frame 35mm cameras. So we're going to put the Sony in there. Now, I've written up a chart of what I'm going to be covering. So I'm going to shoot on the H5 at 50 ISO through all of the aperture settings, 2.8, f4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, 22 and 32, and then shoot at 100 ISO, 200, 400. The CCD is useless beyond 400 ISO. I'm going to shoot up to about 1600 ISO on the H6, maybe go to 3200 ISO, but I've no intention of using a H6 above 1600 ISO, that's for sure. So I'll take the Sony up to the same, although the Sony can go a lot higher. Let's look at my base level shot that we're going to shoot, and then I'll walk you through the setup and the lighting over there. So here's my, if you like, base standard shot on the H5 50 megapixel CCD sensor. This is at f2.8 at 50 ISO at 1/250th of a second sync speed. Now, I can sync much higher on the medium format, but the 35mm cameras can, so we're going to stick with 2/50th of a second. Now, to make sure the shots are strictly accurate, I took this shot without the modeling lights on, so this is purely the flash burst from the studio lights that you're seeing in this image. Now, let me tell you about the shot that I've got set up. My focus point is on that spigot, the studio lighting spigot, and on that hair on the piece of fabric there. I'm now zoomed into 200% on that shot, and we can see that at 2.8, the writing on the paint tin is pretty much in focus. But importantly, that hair and that spigot and the eyelashes on the dummy are in focus. If we move over here, we'll see some of the iron cable is in focus, but the color checker card is not in focus. We need to ensure color accuracy throughout this test. So I've just positioned a color measurement there, and we can see we've got 108, 108, 107. I'm just going to neutralize to that point there, and we'll turn the color card. So we've got 108, 108. So that really is our base value exposure that we want to maintain throughout the shots. So it's the third block down, 1, 2, 3, and we've got readings of 108, 108. If I zoom back out, we take a look, we can see that I've included some black fabric so we can examine shadow detail. We've also got some good shadow detail in that area from the Glenfiddich box casting a shadow. We've got a range of different tones, and over here I've included some backlighting on this sponge so we can look at highlight recovery later as well. On the background, you can see I've put a ball of light which then graduates away finally to deep shadow detail, so we can also check gradations and banding and issues like that. We've got some various difficult colors for cameras to record, from sort of fluorescent greens to turquoise, cyans, blues, fine fabric detail, vivid reds, plus the color checker card in there as well. So I've put a good mix of things in there for a very busy, complicated, ugly shot, but I don't really care. I'm looking at it from the perspective of those items that are important, such as shadow detail, color, fidelity, those sort of things, and we'll be able to look at all those. Let's take a look at the set and the lighting setup. So my lighting is Broncolor lighting, very accurate lighting, accurate to 1/10 of a stop, and I'll be changing the lighting in 1-stop values to suit the aperture changes. This lighting is running off a Scoro pack. I have 3 lights, and you can see the channel of lights going into 1, 2, 3 on the pack. I'm using a Para 88 as the sort of key light onto this area to give me some decent shadow detail, good neutrality, good sparkle of lighting. I have a fluter on the background casting a ball of light which then graduates away so that we can check that tonal banding, and I've got the big softbox. This is a big soft light and also edge lighting the side of the paint tin and the sponge for a little bit of backlighting. If we look at the camera setup, you can see I have a window mask in position here. The window mask is specifically to eliminate any possibility of flare from this shot so that we have a fair test with high contrast and no flare. So this is set up to match the format of the camera and make sure that any backlighting or any stray lighting is not going to cause me flare. We have the camera locked down on the Manfrotto Super Salon stand, so this is all lock steady. I will simply change camera body, use the same lens. Currently using the 80mm standard 2.8 lens that the Hasselblad is usually sold with. I will swap that lens onto the H6 and use exactly the same lens. When it comes to using the Sony, I will use the Sony standard lens, which is the almost equivalent focal length to when you convert to 35mm to medium format. So that will be the 50mm 1.8 lens. So it'll give me about the same image magnification from this perspective. Now, to ensure complete accuracy in these tests, these modeling lights will be going off, and I will be just using the flash burst for each photo and then adjusting the power of the lighting accordingly to ensure the correct exposure for each ISO. But effectively, when I jump from 2.8 to f4 to 5.6 to f8, I'm just going down in exposure by a stop, so I just need to turn the lights up by 1 stop on their global power. Right, now for the H6 100 with the same lens. That's the H6 test. Now for the Sony A7R. Okay, I've had to make a couple of changes with the Sony. First of all, I didn't think it was really fair to use the 50mm 1.8 lens because this lens cost $150, 200 quid or whatever. The Hasselblad 80mm lens, which is still the sort of standard lens for it, is obviously a lot better quality than that lens. So what I've done is I've actually put the G-series 85mm lens, the very expensive $2,000 lens on to give this a fairer chance. Now, because of that, I've just had to move the camera slightly further back so that the magnification of our image matches. So when we zoom in on both, they're going to be fairly similar, so that, you know, it's an equivalent test. I've then managed to find some way of tethering this camera. So I downloaded the Sony software that allows you to shoot tethered via the mini USB. It's quite clunky to use compared to using the Hasselblad Focus, and it's even clunky compared to using Lightroom, because you've got one window that you have to have open for the software to actually capture the shot and change the settings, another one to view the image, and then another one to make any changes to the image. So you've got three separate things you need to use to capture the shot. And then I had to make sure that our measurement readings were the same. So if we take a look in here and I zoom in, I'm just going to zoom in on here. The results, they look pretty good straight off the bat. If I hold over there, you can see that I've managed to get my values very close in exposure. I can set to neutralize, specify a gray point, choose the color picker in the same way that I do in the Focus software, and then I can set that gray point. And I can get my readings right, you know, almost exactly the same exposure level as on the Hasselblad. However, I'm a little bit disappointed straight off the bat with what I'm seeing in terms of resolution. If I zoom in straight away to 200% and I've focused pin sharp, the sharpest point of focus, you see that's slightly out of focus. This is the sharpest point. But you can see there at 200%, that's the image I'm getting on the Sony, which is a 42 megapixel camera. And if we compare that to, say, the Hasselblad, and I zoom in on the Hasselblad to 200%, there we go, you can see immediately there's a huge difference. And so there should be, because, you know, one camera costs a huge amount of money more than the other. But when you look at the overall sort of tonal range, the color, everything I'm seeing on this first test is showing that the Sony, it's doing a pretty good job, but it is not coming anywhere near the Hasselblad H100 camera. So I've now got to shoot through some different aperture settings and some different ISO settings with the Sony so that we've got some like-for-like comparisons. Okay, that's my last shot done on the Sony A7R, which is a 42 megapixel camera. We've tested the H550, which is my CCD sensor, my old one, the H6 100 CMOS sensor, 100 megapixel, and the Sony A7R 42 megapixel CMOS sensor. We'll now load up those files so that we can look at them in detail. To ensure the best possible viewing, please make sure your video is in full HD at 1080 and that you have a reasonable size video window on screen. Keep in mind that with video there is a deterioration in image quality, so we are making these test files available on our website at karltayloreducation.com/H6 test. So here's the first test results. You can see all three cameras at 50 ISO, 64 ISO and 50 ISO, all shot at f11. We can already see the sharpness difference of the H6 over the H5 and also over the Sony A7R. As we move along, you can see the clear difference in sharpness on the text on the image. We zoom back out. And we'll zoom into some highlight detail and detail where it was 8mm as written on the Allen key. So the highlight detail is better on the H6, sharpness is better. Now we can get down to this lower bit. This is quite interesting because we have an area here on the right where the Sony looks sharper on the fabric than the H6. But this is primarily due to the fact that the Sony at f11 has greater depth of field than the H6 does at f11 because the H6 is a medium format sensor. If we change to f16 on the Hasselblad H6, you can see that that depth of field is increased and now matches the depth of field of f11 on the Sony A7R. But for the rest of our tests, we will continue at f11. Here is the point of the image that was the central focus, and we can see that the H6 image is very clear and very detailed. The Sony image is very, very good, but you can see the image is slightly softer. It's obviously a 42 megapixel camera trying to compete with a 100 megapixel camera. This is of particular interest to me because we can see on the Sony that the highlight detail is not recorded as accurately as on the H6, given that both exposure on the cameras is the same in the lighting and recording. We move into the fine detail on the eyelashes of the mannequin's head and the writing on the whiskey packaging, and also on the colour checker card, the finer detail that you can see that has been resolved. You can see clear differences in the cable from the iron, and we zoom back out again. We now change to 100 ISO and repeat the exercise. So the CCD sensor will start to show a little bit of noise. The H6 and the Sony A7R will compete very equally in terms of noise, at least into I think about 400 ISO. But the CCD sensor on the older H5 does not handle high ISOs very well. We can see the extra latitude captured there on the Allen key. And again, we can see some wire problems on the Sony sensor. And of course, the highlight detail is not recorded quite as accurately. But again, a very good result from a 35mm sensor, which is considerably smaller than the large medium format sensor of the H6 100. We now change to 400 ISO. At this point, the CCD sensor will start to become pretty poor in performance. And as you can see, there's quite a lot of noise in the blacks there. The image also starts to deteriorate on the CCD sensor on the H550 CCD. And I must point out, this is not the CMOS sensor, it's the CCD sensor on the older H5. The H6 and the Sony A7 still perform very well at 400 ISO. And again, slight loss of detail in the highlights on the Sony there. Now the mid-tone noise here looks fairly even on both the Sony and the H6, but the shadow detail there on the whiskey box was showing considerable deterioration on the H550 CCD sensor. Now we move to 800 ISO, and the CCD sensor performs very badly now. It's not a camera I would choose to use. I wouldn't use a CCD sensor at 800 ISO, but this shows where clearly the CMOS sensor has an advantage over CCD style sensors. At this point, I would say that the noise in the H6 is less than the Sony, which is what I'd expect from a medium format sensor. So in the shadow areas and the shadow detail, we have a finer grain structure in the noise at 800 ISO on the H6 than we do on the Sony. Also in the midtones on the mannequin's head, we have a finer grain structure on the H6 Hasselblad at 800 ISO than we do compared to the Sony. At 1600 ISO, we gave up on the CCD sensor. It wasn't even worth continuing the test with it. So we now only have the H6 100 and the Sony A7R II, both at 1600 ISO at f11. At this point, they look fairly similar in the deep black area, or sorry, the deep shadow area on that side of the shot. Sony is performing very well at high ISO, as is the Hasselblad H6. The highlight captured detail is still better on the H6. Remember, the Sony looks sharper at the foreground there because of the depth of field differences, but we can still see moire problems and lack of highlight recording in the highlights there on the silk on the Sony. There is also considerably more noise on the mannequin head in the Sony. The grain structure is a little larger, and on the H6 the grain structure is a little finer. And for our final test, we go to 3200 ISO. And the grain structure appears to be better on the H6. Obviously the resolution is greater, but the Sony does perform very, very well. We can see a greater level of noise in the shadow area just to the right of the fabric on the Sony. Highlight detail still lost on the Sony compared to the H6, and considerably more noise in the midtones, or the shadow midtones there, on the mannequin's head. And in the general lighter midtones on the mannequin's face there. At this point, I'm exceptionally impressed with the performance of the H6 at 3200 ISO. This is actually a very usable image from a commercial perspective. Finally, we're now going to look at diffraction issues. So we have the H6 100 back at 64 ISO at f11, and the Sony A7R II at 50 ISO at f11. So we can clearly see the difference in sharpness between the two images, and again in the highlight detail. Now, one issue that was concerning me with the H6 was that the camera may be susceptible to diffraction issues as we stop the lens down from f11 to f16, f22, etc. So we now have a comparison of the stop down from f11 to f16, and we'll try to identify any diffraction problems in doing so. And we can see just the very tiniest amount of softening on the image on the Hasselblad, and also a tiny amount of additional softening on the Sony. So as we stop these expensive lenses down, and remember we were using the G series lens on the Sony as well, which I think is a $2,000 lens. But with both the Sony G series lens and the Hasselblad lens, as we stop down to f16, we do have a tiny amount of diffraction caused to the image. That diffraction will obviously increase as we stop down further. So in conclusion, the H6-100 outperforms the Sony A7R II, which of course would be expected given that the H6 is a approximately, I think, $28,000 camera. The Sony A7R with the lens that I was using was about $4,000 camera, and to give the Sony A7 a good chance, I had to use one of those G series lenses because the very first test I did with the 50mm 1.8 was not good at all. The overriding thing for me is also the tonal range. So the important factors of the tones captured here in the highlights, and then if we look, for example, at the gradation of tones across what here looks like skin tone. So across the mannequin's cheek here and here on the Sony. So you can see the silkiness in the Hasselblad image. The tonal transition is very smooth compared to the Sony. And that's very important to me, especially for product photography. The extra level of detail is, of course, a bonus, but the Sony does perform very, very well. Overall, the ISO capabilities of the Sony was exceptional, but the the Hasselblad H6 did start to win on the ISO at 3200 and 1600, and it matched it in all the other ISOs. Color accuracy on the Sony was very, very good, but I do prefer the true color system of the H6. Of course, the H6 is a more expensive camera system, so the Sony A7R II or equivalent would be an excellent choice if you were working to a tighter budget. Now, the whole reason that I undertook this test was because I was wanting to trade my H550 CCD in for the new H6 camera. And I wanted to be absolutely sure that the capabilities of the H6, especially where diffraction was concerned, would outperform the H550 CCD sensor. Now, whilst the CCD sensor was no good at high ISOs, I still actually preferred the color accuracy of the H5 CCD sensor at the low 50 ISO, but the H6 was only slightly different to the H5, and the variance is there because of the CMOS versus CCD sensor. The advantages going forwards for me with the H6 with the 100 are obviously the higher resolution and, of course, the capability of shooting at higher ISOs, which I've already put into practice. So that's the results of the test. If you would like to see the images in higher quality and explore them for yourselves, we're making them available to download on karltayloreducation.com/H6 test. Subscribe to our channel, get 10% off Squarespace.